Welcome to the beginning of school finance. So we're going to take two paths as we work through our course. One will deal with the textbook and the knowledge information, and then the second will deal with the skills part of actually applying what we're learning and looking at the state aid formula. So this presentation is going to deal with beginning of the book and looking at that. And our first piece in the book deals with the economics of education. And what we're going to look at in this is the reasons that we support public education and some economic principles. And we'll see that an institution like public education follows many economic principles, while at the same time there are some that it doesn't follow. Okay, and so we're going to look at the benefits of an education, those who benefit, those who don't, that kind of stuff. So let's get started. The first thing I want to do here is look at this quote and read through this real quickly here. Each city is subjected to great expenses every year for the construction of roads, fortifying its ramparts, and for buying arms and equipping soldiers. Why should it not spend an equal sum for the support of one or two schoolmasters? The prosperity of a city does not depend solely on its natural riches, on the solidity of its walls, on the elegance of its mansions, and on the abundance of arms in its arsenals, but on the safety and strength of a city reside above all in a good education which furnishes it with instructed, reasonable, honorable, and well-trained citizens. So really what we're going to do is we're going to look at various thoughts that come out of this quote. Okay, and we can start by seeing that this is obviously an old quote by terms like fortifying the ramparts and buying arms and equipping soldiers. Actually, what we see is this is from Martin Luther, who lived at the end of the 15th and into the 16th century. So even back then, the idea of an education and what an education can do for a city, we could change that to say for a society, was evident here. Okay, especially I love the last part where he says the prosperity of a city does not depend solely on its natural riches, so forth, but on the safety and strength of its city reside above all a good education, and the purpose of that, it furnishes the city or society with instructed, reasonable, honorable, and well-trained citizens. So our big question, if we were to have a guiding question, would be where is that line between good education, adequate, and so forth in the 21st century. So let's take that and look at the chapter here. So first of all, we see that education is an investment in human capital. And what we mean by this is that education is a two-way street. And once we get on this, once a society gets on this level, this playing field, it's easier to move upwards. It's somewhat of an incremental pattern that once you can get on it, you can move upwards. But it's sometimes tough to get on it. And so what we're saying here is the public sector invests in human capital, and the human capital supports the private sector. Here we're talking about human capital as education. And when we say public sector, we're talking about specifically schools here. Okay. And so this is one-way street. The schools creating human capital, and that human capital can then be invested within the private sector. The second part of this is that the private sector then increases society, and through taxation, through dollars, supporting the public sector, the government, or here in our case, the schools will then continue the cycle and invest even more in human capital, here obviously the students. So you can see what I mean when I say this is incremental, in the sense that once you get into this cycle, what's given to the private sector becomes incremental. It's when we start pulling back on something that we see the cycle beginning to break down. And we'll talk about this as we go through the course. Okay. So some economic principles here. First of all, we know that societies at the low end, and what we would call today developing societies, devote all or nearly all their efforts to producing essential materials or goods. I think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and basically developing society is at the first level. And unless we can get off of the first level, we're not going to be able to advance. And so when we're faced with struggling to find food and security and things like that, there's no rational reason to produce more than what we need in society. We have to get beyond that point. When we're at that point, anything extra becomes a waste. Okay. In other words, we're looking at the essentials here: food, clothing, and shelter. The greater the degree of advancement, the greater potential for producing additional goods and services. And so what we see then is we can go beyond the essentials of food, clothing, and shelter, and we can start producing luxuries. Well, this is not just in societies, this is in our homes. Okay, you compare a home of somebody who is being aided by government subsidies, and they're looking at mainly the essentials, the luxuries of buying the latest TV, or the latest iPhone, are just that they're luxuries and they can't afford them. Okay, but back to the bigger picture of societies in general. One of those luxuries is education. And education is seen as a luxury in the sense that, well, I lost my train of thought there, but you can see that in a society where you're concentrating on food, clothing, and shelter, that cycle that we just saw in the previous slide, there's not the finances to support public education. So countries that make only a minor effort in education usually produce only the material goods necessary for subsistence. So think of Oklahoma here. Okay, let's go back to the state level here. In Oklahoma, when we're talking about the poor people in Oklahoma, the amount of money spent on the necessities is obviously greater, and little to no money is able to be spent on the luxuries of life. This is the same not just for Oklahoma, but for anybody in general. Whereas for wealthy people or wealthy nations, it's just the opposite. Okay, there is enough money that you take care of the necessities, and you have more money to spend on the luxuries. And so here we see that in the typical lower, middle, and upper class, you can see the idea here of what money is spent on necessities, and then what other monies are spent on luxuries. And we'll talk more about this a little bit when we get into taxing, because obviously taxing is going to limit the necessities or the quality of necessities, but it also cuts into the luxuries. So education is an important industry. Education produces only intangibles in the form of non-material goods and services that are valuable but difficult to measure. In other words, when we're talking about a factory, we can count the number of cars a factory produces, or the number of widgets made in an hour, whatever our factory is. But when it comes to, and not only can we count those things, but we can assign numbers to them and measure productivity and measure profit. Okay. When it comes to education, those kinds of things are intangible, the results of an education. And so they're difficult to measure. In other words, there's no research, empirical studies, satisfactory way to measure the output in education. There's no smoking gun of evidence, in other words, that supports education is important. And so what we have to do then is look at the bigger picture and see what education does for society as a whole compared to those societies that don't have education or have limited education. Education produces non-free services. In other words, indirect costs. Without an education, there is a loss of income for those who don't have it. There is a direct cost for education in the sense of living expenses, fees, textbooks. Those of you who are students right now are obviously paying a direct cost for education. Professors and teachers are exceptions in somewhat in this non-free service idea because they do benefit from the institution itself. But we'll come back and talk about direct costs and indirect costs as well in just a few minutes. So we know that education stimulates economic growth. This is that incremental cycle that I said. Once we can get into this, it's a good thing. For example, increases in education. We know also increased productivity. And therefore, we have gains in what we see in our social lives, political lives, and economic lives. Let me stop on this for just a second. What we're talking about when we say gains in these areas is that an education offers the opportunity for people in the arts, and even something like athletics, to practice those crafts and make a living at those crafts because they're an education in the broader sense provides society with the expendable revenue to participate in those crafts. You know, I don't know how much it costs now to go see the Oklahoma City Thunder play, but the only reason that the Thunder continue to do well, to attract good players, is because people are able to afford to go and buy tickets and buy souvenirs and support the team in that way. So that's what I mean when I say that your economic life, your social life, and those things are enhanced in a society where education is a staple, because you now have that expendable revenue that you can use in various ways, and you're not stuck to that subsistence living of finding food, shelter, and clothing. Okay, so the quality of education is intimately related to its financing. In other words, economists generally agree that adequate expenditures for education lead to increases in markets for goods and services, in business and industrial sales, and in the buying power of individuals and households. Again, it goes back to what I was saying just a minute ago. We know that with an improved education, it increases things like productivity and the person's ability to create wealth and extra revenue that can be spent on things such as arts and leisure and so forth. So all that comes in a society that supports a public education. So some truisms about public sector responsibility. Keep in mind, when we're talking public sector, we're talking about schools here, because school is a public sector. One of the things we know is that the private sector makes change and is able to change at a much more rapid pace than the public sector. Okay, so keep that in mind as we go through and talk about finance and economics throughout the course. That it just takes a while for public sector entities to realize change. Also, we know that government institutions do not react as quickly or obediently to external pressure and public criticism. If I own a company and produce, I don't know, produce widgets. We'll just use a generic term. And suddenly there is no demand for my widgets anymore because somebody has created a better widget, then I can't continue to produce what I'm producing. I have to change and go with a better, even more advanced, okay? And so that pressure to change is much more intense on public institutions or private institutions than it is on the public sector, okay? So another truism there. And then finally, most believe that public education is primarily a state responsibility with some degree of local control. And that's pretty much true. We'll see there are a few exceptions with some school districts, but pretty much we rely on the state to take care of us here in the United States. So we know that, following up on that statement, education is not given by the federal government. The 10th Amendment tells us that the power is not given to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, or reserved to the states respectively, or to the people. And so therefore we know that education, as a result, is a constitutional issue that gives the states the rights to control education. And that's why we see every state has a different approach to education, because it is a state issue. So who is responsible then? Primary responsibility is to, and I would put these in a different order probably. I would say the state, and then local, and then finally federal. In Oklahoma, about 10% of our revenues come from the federal government. The rest, depending on the district, may range from 80 to 85% state, down to almost no state and all local. But by far, most districts rely pretty heavily on the state. So the primary responsibility then in Oklahoma is to the state, and then to the local next, and finally to the federal government. So with that in mind, the inability of educators to communicate with politicians and lawmaking bodies has added to the allocation puzzle. Obviously, many states are in a quandary as to how to deal with public education. It's quite often the most expensive single budget item in a state budget. It certainly is in Oklahoma, where about 34% of the state budget goes into education. It's important that we, as educators, communicate with our legislators, and when we don't, which unfortunately we typically don't, this becomes problematic. So to become effective, educators must be cognizant of the philosophy of individual politicians and be able to communicate with those politicians. And so what Chapter 1 talks about a little bit here is it does give you some background, some economic philosophies, okay? And so depending on what your philosophy is about education in the state, and here I'm talking about the state, not a country, but the state of Oklahoma, you can understand why lawmakers make the decisions that they make. And if you have a different philosophy, then you're going to find some contrast in how you approach it and how lawmakers approach it. And so at that point, it would be up to you, once you are cognizant of these ideas, it would be up to you as an educator to convince the lawmakers that your philosophy is correct, whichever one it may be. So let's look at these real quick. If you believe that education should be free, completely controlled by the state, and financed by the state as well, that is perfectly fine. This is the tradition of Karl Marx and the communists. Okay, here state controlled is in the sense that the state controls what is taught, and more importantly, what is not taught in the schools. Okay, if you believe that it is a government duty to provide a complete education, then you are more in line with John Maynard Keynes. a government interventionist. If you believe that education is vital for technical and human advancement and must be supported to a more significant level by the resources that are abundant in the affluent private economy, then you are more in line with John Kenneth Galbraith, a liberal philosopher, famous during the FDR administration. If you believe, on the other side of that government over-controls education, then you are probably more in line with Milton Friedman, who is a conservative and has led a lot of conservative thinking during the 20th century. And then finally, you may feel that education is simply an essential service of government, and this was Adam Smith, who's a capitalist. So you can see here that depending on your philosophical background, there's a little bit of room as to where the role of government should begin and end. Okay. So the purpose of that is to understand that if you have a different viewpoint than your lawmakers, if we were to go back to the screen about being cognizant of what's happening in your state, then again, you need to be able to express your ideas and your thoughts in a instructive way to lawmakers. So, all right, scope of educational services, supply and demand. Supply and demand is different. This is obviously an economic term, but it's different when it comes to education. Okay, education is not driven by the market. I say it's not driven by the market, but well, we'll get into. You can't talk about education financing without talking about politics, and we'll get into a little bit of why I think this is somewhat market driven later on in the course. But for now, we'll say that education is not driven by the market. In other words, in education, the demands, what people want from an education, must originate from those who pay for its services, but who do not usually receive the benefits directly. And what we're talking about here are people who pay for education through their tax dollars, but do not necessarily receive the benefits of education. Okay, those who are receiving the benefits of an education are those people who have children in the educational system. Those who do not have children in the educational system, maybe they're empty nesters and their children are gone. Maybe they are retired people completely, or maybe they're just people without children, never married, never had children. Those are people who receive the benefits of society when it comes to an enhanced education. And this statement is saying that changes in education must originate from this group of people because they do represent the majority of people in America. For those who pay but who do not receive directly, again, these are the retired people, childless people, unschooled people. The direct result of their investment in education is not very much. Okay, their indirect result, though, is where they see the benefits of an education. They receive those benefits living in a society that has an enhanced education, the ability to move upward in society, the ability to participate in society in meaningful ways, whether it's through arts, through other cultural activities, and so forth. It's because society is at the point where it can invest itself and allow people to develop those skills that are beyond simple subsistence living that they benefit from that. So there are a few principles here that we're just going to touch on dealing with education. The first one is a marginal dollar principle. And this really does impact education directly. And what the marginal dollar principle says is that people are only willing to spend so much on an activity, but beyond that, they're not willing to spend on it, even though they see that it might be good. Okay, and so in education, what we're talking about here is something simple. So society in the United States is willing to pay for common schools through the use of tax dollars. In general, people have no issue with using public money to pay for public education and provide free public education. Up through high school, common schools. They're unwilling to pay beyond that. Okay, in other words, unwilling to pay for higher ed. We obviously don't have free higher ed in America in general. And so this is what that marginal dollar means, is that people are willing to pay a certain point, but beyond that, they're not willing to pay for it. Okay, and where that point lies is up to society. And we have to work to change the ideas in society to change where that marginal principle lies. Obviously, when we're looking at people like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, those people are on the side that says we need to move this marginal dollar principle up to include higher education. Okay, and those on the other side of the spectrum are obviously saying no, we don't need to do that. Same applies for applying each paying at each level. Even though we're willing to pay for common schools at that level, there are limits within that level. Okay, and again, so the marginal dollar principle is at different levels and then levels within levels. Okay, and we'll talk about this obviously when we get to bond issues. Am I going to pass a bond issue for $1 million to build a building, or can I pass one for $1.5 million to build a building and enhance the sports stadium? Okay, the marginal dollar principle will apply there as to what the stakeholders are willing to pay. Another economic principle is the point of diminishing returns, or in other words, cost effectiveness. And here we're saying, is there a direct relationship between dollars spent and student performance? And at what point do we stop spending money on education because we're not seeing the results of it in something like student performance? Okay, again, we talked earlier about how difficult it is to measure education, but if we're going to apply this economic principle, then can we see at what point the diminishing returns begin? Okay, where do we stop investing dollars into education? That's what this principle is stating. And I'm just going to give you two people here real quick. Paul Mort and I believe it's George Coleman are economists who had differing opinions. So no surprise that people had different opinions about this stuff. Paul Mort would say yes. And as far as investing dollars in education to get more, Coleman would say no. Cost only has a minor effect on education. In fact, he said greatly increased expenditures for education have not, cannot, and will not produce such large or fantastic increases or improvement in its product here being student achievement. I will add that these are rather old and antiquated ideas. Coleman came out of the 60s. So where this goes now in the 21st centuries, I had not read the literature on that to see that we have more empirical evidence now that increased monies in education have a net result of greater student achievement. We do know that higher levels of education result in higher levels of earning potential for those who have it. That we do know, and research shows that. And specifically, we're looking at 5 areas where we see this. In labor, higher education means that our workers are more skilled. This can be in hard skills such as ability to actually do things, or it can be more in soft skills such as the ability to think and create. Okay, Whichever skill type we're talking about, we know that through more education, our labor force becomes more effective. Capital, as a result of more investment in education, society is increased, and therefore society now has more money to reinvest and put back into education. Think back to that two-way cyclical path that I showed you at the beginning of this presentation. Technology, we know that we are truly on an incremental path with our technological advancements, and as a result of that, we've heard numerous stories that talk about, we're have students in elementary school that we're training for careers that haven't even been developed yet. And that's what we need here. But the only way we can get to that point, or that we have been able to get to that point, is because of the advancements we've made and investments we've made in education. Also, resources, human, physical, and financial resources, we know that these are all improved and refined through education. And then finally, in management, we know that an educated citizenry is able to work together more efficiently as a group and also individually. So we know that there is a relationship between the investment in education and the productivity of a nation. Expenditures in education then benefit both individuals and society. We've talked about this a little bit already. There's more appreciation for the arts and culture. There's ability to participate more fully in the democratic process. The likelihood of the child of a college graduate to go to college increases dramatically, which further increases the education level in America or in society. And the whole society benefits from various scientific inventions. We have higher skilled, soft and hard skills, and more motivated workers, better jobs, higher salaries, and all this again continues to feed back in and gives us more tax money for education and benefits society's program and increases our economic cycle. So we know that there are benefits to individuals and society. They're economic. There are also some non-economic benefits to a formalized education. Even though it's ran by the states, in general we have perpetuation of our form of government. We infuse within our students the importance of democracy and encourage everybody to work in democracy. We also instill in our young people a source or a sense of moral values. Go into an elementary school any day and you can hear people saying, teachers telling students don't lie, don't cheat, don't steal, those kinds of things. Schools are also a source of ethical values. It's where we learn to tolerate those who are different, reject prejudices that we see, and support equality within society. Okay, and finally, in the big picture, to preserve our nation's culture and the sense of identity. Those are non-economic benefits that we can spread throughout society through a public education. External benefits to education. Society deemed it advisable to require the consumption of a minimum amount of education by all its citizens. In other words, every state has compulsory education laws, and with very few exceptions, which if you haven't taken school law, you will learn about those exceptions. Everybody is required to go to public schooling through high school. We know then, just to kind of reiterate, the greater number of educated citizens we have, the higher standard of living, the greater our economic growth, and so forth. Just to kind of wrap this up a little bit here, one more principle that we need to look at is what we call the exclusion principle. And this says that the benefits of an economic adventure belong only to the purchaser, thus excluding all others. So the exclusion principle would state that those who participate in education are the only ones that benefit from it. But from all that we have just said in the last few minutes, we know that education does not follow this principle. That with an education, we now have lower social costs, increased wealth, greater taxes, greater income and taxes to continue the cycle. Development of those 5 elements that we talked about, resource, labor, capital, technology, and management. Okay. So the exclusion principle then does not apply to education because education goes beyond that. So that's an introduction to some basic economic principles and how they apply to education. We will move forward, and in the next chapter we're going to look at how we adequately finance education. And in that sense, we're going to talk about what kind of costs there are in education and how these costs have increased, and what happens if we don't address these increasing costs that we're seeing happening in education. So hopefully that gives you, again, a basic idea of some economic principles and an economic way of looking at education.